Hello, Mrs.Perez. This is going to be my project based on how history repeats itself. I have to ultimately thank my grandpa for this because if it weren't for him, I wouldn't know any of this. So let's hop right into it. This one is going to be about Napoleon Bonaparte, or whatever his name is. I probably butchered it, but I'm going to butcher a couple of things in this. So, Napoleon had taken Europe by storm around the time of 1812. Most of the Central and Western Europe was under his control by that time. The only country that was even remotely had enough power to face him was the British. And Napoleon had one of the greatest fighting forces at his disposal. And in order to stop Britain, he would have to stop trade from Russia to Britain. Russia would have had no chance by being overpowered by Napoleon's army. Russia took a tactic known as the scorched earth policy, which we'll get into later, by burning down the crops and survival necessities, forcing Napoleon's army to survive off the land ultimately during the winter time, by the way. Taking an attrition toll of 130,000 men when at first they had 422,000 men. And it just started to dwindle. It just started to dwindle as they went along, and they finally confronted the Russians. Um, and the Russians had 130,000 men, where no, the French had 130,000 men, where the Russians had 127,000 men. So, facing off in Borodino, or the Battle of Borodino, September 7, 1812, the French army was now exhausted after the battle. They ultimately had won, but not necessarily. They didn't ever seal the deal because Napoleon could have still used his imperial forces or imperial guards, yeah, the imperial guards to flush out the Russian army, but they didn't. So they ultimately took a huge attrition toll, and now now after taking over that part of Russia, yeah, they won. They were victorious, but with no rations, a deadly winter, and still intact Russian army, the French started to drop like flies from 422,000 men at the beginning of this time to only 20,000 men after the battle. Very costly victory, very, very costly. And another one, my personal favorite, the Battle for Moscow. In 1941, the German army breached over the Soviet border. Um, Germany had the idea to take Russia by autumn. Germany went around the Russian army, so the Russian army set up a barricade around, well, not around Moscow, but in front of Moscow, and the German army went around them. And that meant that they could just march straight into Moscow, and the Russian army would just get shot in the back. Russia had used the same tactics that the German army. Uh, so excuses, but let's say that the French were the Germans now. Russia used the same battlefield, same tactics that the Russians would have used fighting Napoleon. So they were on the same battlefield as 1812. So what they did was they took these tanks, and since they were up on high mounds, and had big enough gaps in between so that they could fit the cannon through, and and oh, the mounds would basically shield the tanks, and so that way they could just bombard enemies that try to push forward for a whole day, and they were just getting torn to shreds, basically. Okay. Germans had an overpowering advantage against the Red Army because Germany was one of the most. They were a superpower back then. They were ungodly strong. Uh, so Stalin had ordered for two things to happen: a scorched earth policy, burn down all of the community centers behind the Germans, and to push back the water in the Ivan Shkorsky Reservoir, which is a reservoir that could have made it easier for the German army to cross over if it was on ice, because during the time it was winter. But since it was man-made, they were able to push back the water, with meaning that without that ice being there, they would have to go around, and they would just take an attrition toll. So, with no place to keep supplies or to rest or anything, the Germans would have to face the Russians head on. Germany lacked the proper boots and gear to stay warm, whereas the Red Army knew about their own weather, having their own proper materials. So at the end of this battle over Moscow, 2 million lives were taken on both sides. Russia was victorious, and this was one of the most greatest defeats for Germany at the time. But how does history repeat itself? Well, they did the same thing that Napoleon's army did. They went into Russia during the wintertime, expecting to get rid of everything there. Like, they were expecting to take over Russia. That's the same thing that Napoleon did, which he did successfully, but not very. And Hitler did the same thing. And the same thing even happened in World War One. It's impossible to go up against Russia, the Russian winter, and it's happened a couple of times throughout history. So does history repeat itself? In the end, I would say yes, it does. Thank you.